Some losses cut so deep, they change the shape of your soul forever. That's what happened to Elijah Trow after he buried his wife in the cold Wyoming ground. In 1884, this broken widower paid $10 for an abandoned cabin high in the mountains, hoping to disappear from a world that no longer made sense. He wanted nothing more than silence and a place to wait out his remaining years. But when he opened that cabin door, he found a massive grizzly bear inside, settled in like it owned the place. Most folks would grab their gun or run for their lives. Elijah just stood there, staring at this wild creature that seemed as lost as he felt. What came next was the strangest friendship you've ever heard of. How do two broken souls find healing? In the wilderness, when one of them happens to be a 1,000-pound bear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gold piece had been warm in Elijah's palm when he handed it over to the land agent in Cheyenne 3 weeks prior. $10 for a cabin nobody wanted, perched on a ridge so remote that even the Postal Service had given up on it years ago. The agent, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, had looked at Elijah like he was buying his own grave. Maybe he was. The ride up into the Wyoming highlands had taken 2 days, his packhorse loaded with supplies that felt more like anchors than necessities. Every mile gained in elevation was a mile further from the cemetery where Sarah lay beneath a granite stone that read, "Beloved Wife." The words carved there felt inadequate now, like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. Sarah Ellen Trow had been 22 when they married in the spring of 1861, her auburn hair catching sunlight like copper wire, her laugh bright enough to chase shadows from any room. Elijah had been 25 then, already weathered by frontier life, but still young enough to believe that love could shield a man from the world's cruelties. They'd built their homestead together in the valley below Laramie, 40 acres of promise bordered by cottonwoods and crossed by a creek that sang them to sleep each night. For 18 years, that little spread had been paradise. Sarah tended a garden that defied the harsh Wyoming climate, coaxing tomatoes and beans from soil that should have grown nothing but sage and disappointment. Elijah worked the trap lines, following beaver and mink through creek beds and mountain meadows, his hands growing more skilled with each season. In winter they'd sit by the fire while Sarah mended his gear and he carved small figures from pine, horses, bears, eagles, that she'd arrange on the mantel like a wooden menagerie. They'd talked about children in those early years, planned names and painted pictures of little ones learning to ride and fish and read by lamplight. But the babies never came, and after a while they stopped talking about it. Sarah poured her maternal instincts into orphaned calves and injured birds, while Elijah built her shelves for the books she ordered from Denver and Chicago. She read everything: poetry, philosophy, novels about places they'd never see. In the evenings she'd read aloud while he worked on his carvings, her voice painting worlds beyond their valley. "Listen to this," she'd say, adjusting her spectacles. And then she'd share some passage about love or loss, or the way light falls through cathedral windows. Her voice had a quality that made even grocery lists sound like scripture. The illness came in the winter of 1883, subtle at first. Sarah complained of being tired, of food tasting strange. By spring, she was coughing blood into handkerchiefs. She tried to hide from him. The doctor in Laramie shook his head and prescribed laudanum for the pain, as if opium could fill the holes that consumption was carving in her lungs. Elijah watched her fade through the summer, like a photograph left. In sunlight, her vibrant presence becoming transparent, ghostly. She died on a Tuesday in September, holding his hand as the first snow dusted the peaks. Her last words were about the garden, instructions for saving seeds she'd never plant again. After the funeral, the silence in their cabin had been unbearable. Every corner held memories that cut like glass. Sarah's books still lay open where she'd left them. Her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table. Her pillow still held the faint scent of the lavender sachets she made from flowers grown by her own hands. Elijah tried to stay. For 3 months, he kept the routines they'd built together, talking to her empty chair at breakfast, reading her books aloud to the walls. But the loneliness was a living thing that followed him through each day, growing heavier with every sunrise that failed to bring her back. That's when he'd ridden into Cheyenne and found the land agent with his ledger of unwanted properties. The cabin on Highland Ridge had been abandoned for 5 years, the agent explained. Too remote, too difficult to supply, too dangerous with all the bears and wolves. Perfect, Elijah had thought. A place where a man could disappear properly. Now, standing in the cabin doorway with a grizzly bear staring back at him, Elijah wondered if he'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. The bear was enormous, easily 8 feet tall if it stood, on its hind legs, with fur the color of dark honey and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to be measuring him. It lay sprawled across what had once been the cabin's main room, looking for all the world like it belonged there. Elijah's hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle slung across his shoulder, but he didn't draw it. Something in the bear's posture, calm, watchful but not aggressive, made him pause. This wasn't a snarling predator defending territory. This was simply another squatter, another creature seeking shelter from the world. The cabin itself was in better shape than he'd expected. The roof looked sound, the stone chimney intact. Someone had built this place to last, with thick log walls and a solid foundation. The windows were grimy but unbroken, and the wooden floor, though dusty, showed no signs of rot. Under different circumstances, it might have been cozy. The bear shifted slightly, a rumble deep in its chest that wasn't quite a growl, more like a question. Its ears were forward, alert, but not flattened in anger. Elijah found himself studying the creature, with the same attention he'd once given to tracking prey through snow. This bear was old, he realized. Grey threads ran through the brown fur around its muzzle, and there was a deliberate quality to its movements that spoke of experience and caution. "Well," Elijah said aloud, his voice rusty from disuse, "this is unexpected." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it didn't move. If anything, it seemed to settle more comfortably against the far wall, as if his words had been an invitation to stay. Elijah stepped back from the doorway, leaving it open behind him. His pack horse whickered softly from where he'd tied it to. A pine tree, sensing the tension but not yet catching scent of the bear. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, painting long shadows across the small clearing. Soon it would be dark, and then what? Sleep under the stars while a 1,000-pound predator claimed his bed? He pulled Sarah's wedding ring from his vest pocket, a habit he'd developed in the month since her death. The gold was warm from being close to his heart, and he rubbed it between his thumb and finger like a worry stone. Sarah would have laughed at this situation, he thought. She'd always been braver than him when it came to wild things, hand-feeding raccoons and talking to deer like they were neighbors. "What would you do, darling?" he whispered to the ring. The wind through the pines provided no answer, but somehow he felt less alone asking the question. He tucked the ring away and shouldered his pack, accepting that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be what he'd planned. Nothing had been what he'd planned since the day Sarah stopped breathing. As if sensing his resignation, the bear shifted again, this time rising to its feet with surprising grace. For a moment, Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs. But the bear simply moved to the far corner of the cabin, settling down again with its back to the wall and its eyes on the door. Watching, waiting, but not threatening. "All right then," Elijah said, unsure whether he was talking to the bear or to fate itself. "I reckon we'll figure this out as we go." The first stars were beginning to appear overhead as he unpacked his bedroll and spread it on the cabin's narrow porch. It wasn't the fresh start he'd imagined, but maybe that was fitting. Nothing about his life had gone according to plan since Sarah died. Why should this be any different? Inside the cabin, the bear made small sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of fur against wood, not the sounds of an agitated predator, but of a creature settling in for the night, making itself at home in a place that belonged, technically, to Elijah Trow. As he lay back on his bedroll and pulled his blanket to his chin, Elijah found himself wondering about the bear's story. What had driven it to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin? What losses or hardships had led it to this remote ridge, so far from the usual haunts of its kind? The questions followed him into sleep, mixing with dreams of Sarah's voice and the weight of a gold ring that had once symbolized forever. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost painting the pine needles silver and Elijah's breath forming clouds. In the mountain air, he'd slept poorly on the hard porch boards, waking every hour to the sound of movement inside the cabin. Not threatening sounds, just the normal stirrings of a large creature making itself comfortable. Each time, he'd lain still and listened, his hand resting on the stock of his Winchester rifle, until the sound subsided and he could drift back into uneasy sleep. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the canopy, he sat up and stretched muscles stiff from the cold ground. The cabin door remained open as he'd left it, and from within came the deep, rhythmic breathing of something still asleep. His pack horse stood where he'd tethered it, ears pricked forward with nervous attention, but showing no signs of panic. Animals knew things, and his horse's relative calm suggested the bear inside posed no immediate threat. Elijah rose quietly and moved to build a small fire in the clearing, using dry pine needles and twigs to coax flames from his tinder. The familiar ritual of making coffee helped settle his nerves, though he kept glancing toward the cabin doorway. Soon, the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the morning air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and pine resin. That's when the bear appeared. It moved through the doorway with surprising quiet for such a massive creature, pausing at the threshold to test the air with its black nose. Morning light revealed details that shadows had hidden the night before. This was a mature boar grizzly, probably weighing close to 600 pounds, with claws as long as Elijah's fingers and a presence that commanded respect. But there was something else in its bearing, a weary quality that reminded Elijah of old soldiers he'd known, men who'd seen too much and carried invisible wounds. The bear's small, dark eyes fixed on Elijah across the clearing. Neither moved. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, filled with the crackle of burning wood and the distant call of a hawk somewhere high overhead. Elijah felt his pulse quicken, but not with fear exactly. More like the hyper-alert calm that had kept him alive during the war, when split-second decisions meant the difference between going home and going into the ground. "Morning," he said softly, as if greeting a neighbor. The bear's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, but it remained motionless in the doorway. Elijah could see intelligence in those dark eyes, an awareness that went beyond simple animal instinct. This creature was thinking, evaluating, making decisions. Slowly, moving with deliberate care, Elijah poured coffee into his tin cup and took a sip. The bear watched every movement, but showed no sign of aggression. Its breathing was steady, its posture relaxed despite the alertness in its eyes. Whatever this was, it wasn't a territorial challenge, at least not yet. "That's my cabin you're sleeping in," Elijah said conversationally, testing the boundaries of this strange encounter. "Got the papers to prove it, though I don't suppose that means much to you." The bear tilted its massive head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with movements as measured as Elijah's own, it stepped fully out of the cabin and settled onto its haunches, about 20 feet away. Close enough to reach him in 2 bounds if it chose, far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. Elijah's rifle leaned against a nearby tree, loaded and ready, but he made no move toward it. Something in the bear's manner suggested that reaching for the weapon might change the careful balance they were establishing. Instead, he took another sip of coffee and studied his unexpected companion. Up close, he could see that the bear bore scars. Old ones, healed but permanent. A ragged line ran across its left shoulder, probably from a fight with another bear. Its right ear was torn at the tip, giving it a slightly rakish appearance. These were the marks of a survivor, a creature that had faced dangers and lived to. "I carry the proof. You've had your share of troubles too, haven't you?" Elijah murmured. The bear made a sound, not quite a growl, more like a rumbling acknowledgement deep in its chest. Its eyes never left Elijah's face, but there was something almost companionable in its attention, as if it were participating in a conversation rather than simply tolerating an intruder. Minutes passed in this strange communion. Elijah finished his coffee while the bear remained seated, both of them taking the measure of the other. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and warming the air, but neither moved from their positions. It was like the opening moves of a chess game, played by species that didn't share a language, but understood the rules of engagement. Finally, the bear rose to its feet, a fluid motion that demonstrated the power hidden beneath its bulky exterior. Elijah tensed slightly, but the creature simply turned and ambled toward the tree line, moving with the rolling gait characteristic of its kind. At the edge of the clearing, it paused and looked back, as if to say that this conversation was far from over. Then it disappeared into the forest, leaving only the impression of its massive paws in the soft earth and the lingering scent of wild musk. Elijah released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands were steady as he poured another cup of coffee, but his mind was racing. In 30 years of frontier life, he'd encountered plenty of bears, black bears mostly, but a few grizzlies too. He'd learned to give them wide berth, to secure his food and avoid surprising them on the trail. But he'd never experienced anything like this morning's encounter. This bear wasn't just sharing space with him, it was communicating. The way it had positioned itself, the careful timing of its movements, the almost conversational quality of that rumbling sound it had made. This was no ordinary animal interaction. With the bear gone, Elijah finally felt safe enough to explore his new property properly. The cabin was indeed in good condition, built by someone who understood mountain construction. The walls were solid, lodgepole pine, chinked with mud and moss that had hardened over the years. The floor was made of split logs, worn smooth by use. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing well when he tested it with a small fire. Evidence of the bear's occupancy was everywhere. Shed fur caught in the rough wood, the musky scent of its presence, a depression in the corner where it had clearly been sleeping. But there was no damage. No destroyed furniture or torn walls. The bear had been a remarkably considerate tenant. As he unloaded his supplies, Elijah found himself listening for sounds of the creature's return. Part of him hoped it would stay gone, that he could claim his solitude and begin the quiet fade from the world he'd planned. But another part, a part he didn't want to examine too closely, felt oddly disappointed by its absence. The day passed in the routine tasks of making camp. He swept out the cabin, arranged his few possessions, and checked the roof for leaks. His horse finally relaxed with the bear gone, grazed contentedly on the sparse mountain grass. By afternoon, Elijah had a serviceable shelter and a hot meal cooking over his fire. That's when the bear came back. It emerged from the trees as quietly as before, but this time it carried something in its mouth, a large fish, probably a trout, from one of the high mountain streams. The bear moved directly to the cabin and disappeared inside, as if it had never left. Elijah stared at the empty doorway, spoon halfway to his mouth. The audacity of it struck him as almost humorous. The bear had gone fishing for the day and returned home to find a squatter in its den. And yet there had been no aggression, no attempt to drive him away. Instead, there was something that felt almost like acceptance. As evening shadows lengthened across the clearing, Elijah made a decision that surprised him. Instead of sleeping on the porch again, he spread his bedroll just outside the cabin. A door close enough to hear any movement from within, but not so close as to crowd the bear's space. "This is temporary," he called softly through the doorway, "just until we figure out some other arrangement." A rumbling sound from inside might have been agreement or dismissal, impossible to tell which. That night Elijah slept better than he had in months, lulled by the steady breathing of the creature just a few feet away. For the first time since Sarah's death, he wasn't entirely alone in the world, even if his only companion was a 600-pound grizzly bear with unclear intentions and a talent for fishing. When morning came, the strange dance would begin again. But tonight, two solitary souls shared the same small piece of mountain wilderness, each keeping watch while the other slept. The pattern established itself over the following days, like a careful waltz between unlikely partners. Each morning, the bear would emerge from the cabin shortly after sunrise, acknowledge Elijah's presence with what had become their customary moment of mutual assessment, then disappear into the forest for hours at a time. During these absences, Elijah would venture inside to organize his belongings and make small improvements to their shared living space. It was during one of these explorations that he discovered the bear's own story written in claw marks and shed fur. In the corner where the creature slept, Elijah found evidence that broke his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Small tufts of different colored fur, lighter brown, almost golden, were caught in the rough wood of the walls. The fur was too fine to be from the adult bear, too precious in the way it had been preserved in these protected spots. Cub fur. The bear had been a mother. More telling were the scratch marks on the cabin walls near that corner. They weren't random gouges, but deliberate patterns, almost ritualistic in their precision. Elijah had seen similar behavior in creatures mourning their young, the way horses would return to stand over the graves of their foals, or how dogs would carry their dead puppies to secret places. These scratches told a story of loss that transcended species. The realization changed everything about how he saw his uninvited roommate. This wasn't just a bear seeking shelter. This was a mother keeping vigil in a place where her cubs had died. Suddenly, her territorial claim to the cabin made perfect sense, as did her acceptance of his presence. Grief recognized grief, even across the boundaries of species. That afternoon, when the bear returned from her daily wandering, Elijah was ready with an offering. He'd caught 3 trout from a stream he'd discovered an hour's hike down the ridge, and he placed 2 of them near the cabin door before retreating to his usual spot by the fire. The bear paused at the sight of the fish, her dark eyes moving. From the gift to Elijah's face, for a long moment she stood perfectly still, and he wondered if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then she moved forward, not to take the fish, but to lie down beside them, her massive head resting on her. Pause as she watched him across the clearing. "Lost your babies, didn't you?" Elijah said softly. The bear made that rumbling sound again, but this time it carried a different quality, lower, more mournful. Her eyes, usually so alert and watchful, seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Sarah, and I never had children," Elijah continued, finding comfort in speaking his thoughts aloud. "Always figured there'd be time for that later, you know. But later has a way of never coming." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the evening air. Maybe that was a blessing, considering how things turned out. "Can't imagine losing a child on top of everything else." The bear lifted her head at the sound of Sarah's name, as if recognizing the pain in his voice. She rose slowly and moved to the fish, but instead of eating them immediately, she carried one to Elijah and dropped it at his feet, before returning to consume the other. The gesture hit him like a physical blow. This magnificent, dangerous creature was sharing her food with him, not out of submission or fear, but as an equal, as someone who understood loss and deserved comfort in return. Over the following days, their relationship deepened into something that defied easy description. They developed a routine that worked for both of them. Mornings, belonged to solitude. The bear would leave early, and Elijah would tend to his camp and explore the surrounding wilderness. Afternoons were for cautious interaction, sitting in the clearing while maintaining respectful distance. Evenings brought a companionable silence, each going about their preparations for night while remaining aware of the other's presence. Elijah began talking to the bear during these evening hours, telling her stories about his life with Sarah. He described their wedding day, when Sarah had worn her grandmother's dress and insisted on wildflowers instead of store-bought bouquets. He talked about the harsh winter of '71, when they'd been snowed in for 3 weeks and had lived on beans and preserved meat, playing cards by candlelight and planning improvements to their homestead. The bear seemed to listen, her ears forward, and her eyes fixed on his face. Sometimes she would make small sounds, not quite growls, more like comments or questions. Elijah found himself responding as if they were having an actual conversation, and perhaps, in some way beyond language, they were. One evening, as he whittled a piece of pine by firelight, Elijah realized what he was carving. Without conscious thought, his knife had shaped the wood into the rough form of a bear cub. The proportions were wrong, too stocky, ears too large, but there was something endearing about its clumsy charm. When he looked up, he found the bear watching him intently, her gaze fixed on the wooden figure in his hands. "It's not very good," he said, holding up the carving. "Sarah always said I was better with traps than with art." The bear rose and moved closer than she ever had before, stopping just outside arm's reach. Her nostrils flared as she scented the fresh wood shavings, and something in her expression seemed to shift. For the first time since they'd begun this strange cohabitation, she looked truly vulnerable, the careful wariness dropping away to reveal raw grief underneath. "How long ago?" Elijah asked quietly. She couldn't answer, of course, but somehow he knew. Recent enough for the wounds to be fresh, old enough for her to have learned to carry the pain. Like him, she was navigating the terrible landscape of loss, trying to find her footing in a world that no longer made sense. That night, for the first time, the bear didn't retreat immediately to her corner of the cabin. Instead, she lay down, in the doorway, her massive body blocking the entrance but not preventing him from seeing inside. It was a position that offered protection to both of them. She could watch for external threats while keeping him in sight, and he could rest, knowing that nothing dangerous would get past her without warning. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. A soft rumble from the doorway suggested she understood. As sleep took him, Elijah reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd come to this mountain to die alone, to fade away from a world that had taken everything he loved. Instead, he'd found another broken soul who understood the weight of absence, who knew what it meant to wake each morning and remember all over again what was gone. The wooden bear cub rested in his palm, and for the first time in months, Elijah fell asleep without Sarah's wedding ring clutched in his other hand. Somewhere in the careful trust developing between him and the grieving mother bear, he was beginning to remember that healing didn't always require solitude. Sometimes it required the presence of another soul who understood that the world could be survived even when it felt impossible to bear. By the end of his first week on Highland Ridge, Elijah had begun keeping a journal, something he hadn't done since his soldiering days during the war. The impulse came unexpectedly one morning as he watched the bear emerge from the cabin with her usual deliberate grace, and he realized he wanted to remember these strange days, to capture somehow the peculiar comfort he was finding in this unlikely companionship. He wrote in the evenings by firelight, using a stub of pencil and pages torn from an old ledger book he'd brought for keeping track of supplies. The first entries were simple observations about weather and routine, but gradually they became something more, a record of conversations that had no words, of understanding that transcended the boundaries between human and wild. October 15th, 1884, She brought me a pine cone today, not dropped it near me like the fish, but actually placed it beside my coffee cup while I wasn't looking. When I turned around, she was sitting 20 feet away, watching to see what I'd make of her gift. The cone was perfect, no damage, scales tight and regular. She'd chosen it carefully. I don't know what it means to her, but to me, it felt like friendship. The bear's daily patterns had become as familiar to Elijah as his own breathing. She woke before dawn, but remained in the cabin until full sunrise, as if she enjoyed those quiet moments between sleep and the day's responsibilities. When she finally emerged, she would always pause in the doorway to check on him, her dark eyes taking inventory of his condition and mood, before she disappeared into the forest. Her hunting grounds extended far beyond what Elijah could explore. On foot, sometimes she'd return in the afternoon with fresh fish, other times with evidence of having raided berry patches or found other sources of food. Once she came back with mud on her paws and the scent of mineral springs clinging to her fur, and Elijah made a mental note to search for hot springs in the area. They would be a blessing as winter approached, but it was during the evening hours that their true communication developed. Elijah had begun reading aloud from one of Sarah's books, a volume of poetry she'd particularly loved. He wasn't sure what impulse drove him to do it, except that the silence sometimes felt too heavy, and Sarah's voice in these verses seemed to fill the space between him and the bear with something approaching warmth. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep," he read one evening, his voice carrying across the clearing. "But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." The bear had lifted her massive head at the sound of the poetry, her ears forward with attention. Something about the rhythm of the words seemed to reach her, and she made one of her rumbling responses, not quite approval, but acknowledgement that something meaningful had been shared. Sarah loved frost, Elijah told her, closing the book but keeping his finger between the pages. Said he understood that life was beautiful and hard in equal measure, and that both parts were necessary to make sense of the whole. The bear shifted her position, settling more comfortably, as if preparing for a longer conversation. This had become her signal that she was ready to listen, and Elijah had learned to recognize it. "She was right about most things," he continued, staring into the fire. "Smarter than me by a long measure, though she was too kind to say so directly. Always reading, always learning something new. She could have married a doctor or a lawyer, someone who could have given her a fine house in town and all the books she wanted. Instead, she chose a broken-down trapper who couldn't even give her the children she deserved." The bear made a sound, a low, questioning rumble that seemed to challenge his assessment of himself. "You think I'm being too hard on myself?" Elijah asked, surprised to find himself seeking the opinion of a wild animal. "Maybe so. Sarah always said that too. Told me I judged myself by standards I'd never apply to anyone else." October 20th, 1884. Woke up this morning to find her sitting beside my bedroll, just watching me sleep. Should have been terrifying, 600 pounds of predator close enough to touch. Instead, it felt safe, protected, like having a guardian that could tear a man in half, but chose to be gentle instead. She didn't move away when I stirred, just met my eyes with that steady gaze of hers. We stayed like that for several minutes, and I had the strangest sense that she was checking on me the way Sarah used to do, making sure I was truly rested, that the nightmares hadn't visited. How does a wild animal learn tenderness? Or maybe the question is how we convince ourselves that wildness and tenderness can't exist in the same creature. The weather was turning colder as October progressed, and both Elijah and the bear began making preparations for winter. She spent more time foraging, building up the fat reserves that would sustain her through the harsh mountain months. He gathered firewood and reinforced the cabin's chinking, preparing for temperatures that could drop well below zero, and snow that might isolate them for weeks at a time. It was during one of these preparation days that their relationship took another unexpected turn. Elijah was on the cabin roof, replacing some loose chinking between the logs, when his foot slipped on the frost-slicked surface. He slid toward the edge with alarming speed, his tools scattering as he scrambled for purchase on the smooth bark. The bear's roar shook the clearing, a sound of pure alarm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. By the time Elijah managed to arrest his slide and look down, she was directly beneath him, positioned to break his fall if he couldn't hold on. Her massive frame was coiled with tension, ready to catch a falling human who weighed a fraction of what she could easily support. "I'm all right," he called down, his voice shaky with adrenaline. "Just lost my footing." But the bear didn't move until he'd safely climbed down from the roof. And even then she stayed close, sniffing him carefully, as if checking for injuries he might not have noticed. "Thank you," he said simply, and meant it more than any thanks he'd ever given. That evening, she didn't retreat to her corner of the cabin as usual. Instead, she settled down directly beside the fire, close enough to Elijah that he could feel the warmth radiating from her thick fur. It was a position that spoke of complete trust. No escape route, no defensive advantage, just the simple comfort of proximity. October 25th, 1884, she's been having dreams. Bad ones, I think. Sometimes at night I hear her making sounds, not threatening, but distressed, whimpering almost, like a dog caught in a nightmare. When I speak to her softly, she quiets, but I can feel her tension through the cabin walls. I understand those dreams, the ones where you're trying to protect someone, and you can't reach them in time, where you watch helplessly as everything you love disappears. Sarah visited me in dreams like that for months after she died, always just out of reach, always slipping away no matter how hard I tried to hold on. Maybe that's what brought us both to this cabin, the need to find a place where the dreams can't follow. One night, when the bear's distressed sounds seemed particularly acute, Elijah made a decision that surprised him. He picked up his bedroll and moved it inside the cabin, spreading it near the door, where he could see both the bear and the outside world. When she noticed his presence, she lifted her great head and looked at him with what seemed like gratitude. "Bad dreams are worse when you're alone," he said quietly. "Figured we might both sleep better with company." The bear settled back down, but now her breathing was calmer, more relaxed. Within minutes, both of them had drifted into the deepest sleep either had experienced in months, two wounded creatures keeping watch over each other's rest. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering their mountain sanctuary in a blanket of pristine white. Inside the cabin, a man and a bear shared the simple comfort of not being alone in their grief. And perhaps that was the first step toward something that might eventually be called healing. The first heavy snow came in early November, falling steadily for 3 days until the world outside their cabin disappeared beneath 2 feet of pristine white. Elijah woke on the 4th morning to find the bear pressed against the cabin wall near his bedroll, sharing her warmth in the way that wild animals understood survival better than most humans ever would. "Cold night," he murmured, his breath visible. In the frigid air inside the cabin, the bear made a low sound of agreement, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows. She'd positioned herself between him and the worst of the cold draft that seeped through the chinking, using her massive body as a living windbreak. Elijah built up the fire and put coffee on to brew, moving quietly around his unlikely roommate. The bear watched his morning routine with the attention of someone learning a new language, her gaze following every familiar gesture. Over the past weeks, she'd become remarkably attuned to his habits and moods, often anticipating his needs before he fully recognized them himself. When he pulled his pack toward him to retrieve something warmer to wear, his fingers brushed against the carefully wrapped bundle he'd been carrying since leaving his old homestead. Sarah's patchwork quilt, the one she'd worked on during the long winter evenings of their early marriage, piecing together scraps of fabric from worn-out clothes and leftover dress material into something beautiful and functional he'd planned. to use it as a bed cover when he reached the cabin. But somehow it had felt too precious to unfold, too connected to memories that might prove too painful to bear. Now, with winter settling around them like a siege, practicality overcame sentiment. The quilt unfolded in a cascade of colors and patterns. Blue calico from Sarah's favorite dress, brown wool from one of his old work shirts, bright yellow cotton from a summer blouse she'd worn when they were courting. Each patch told a story, held a memory, carried the imprint of Sarah's careful fingers. The bear's reaction was immediate and startling. She rose to her feet and moved closer, her nose working, to catch the scent that clung to the fabric. When she reached out with one massive paw to touch the quilt, her movement was so gentle it barely disturbed the folds. "That's Sarah's work," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "Took her 2 winters to finish it. Every stitch done by hand, every piece placed just so." He smoothed the fabric with reverent fingers. "She said it would keep us warm long after she was gone, and I reckon she was right about that too." The bear settled back on her haunches, but her eyes remained fixed on the quilt. Something in her posture suggested recognition, not of the object itself, but of the love and care that had gone into its making. She understood, with the deep wisdom of creatures who lived close to life and death, that this was more than mere fabric. That night, Elijah spread the quilt over his bedroll for the first time since Sarah's death. The bear watched the process with quiet attention, and when he finally lay down, she moved to a position where she could keep watch over both him and the precious covering that connected him to his lost love. November 8th, 1884. The quilt changes everything, not just because it's warmer, though it is, but because it brings Sarah into this place in a way that feels right instead of painful. The bear seems to understand that it's important. She's more careful around it, gentler in her movements when she passes close to where I sleep. Maybe that's what healing looks like, not forgetting what we've lost, but finding ways to carry it that don't break us. The deep snow transformed their daily routines completely. The bear could no longer range as far for food, and her foraging expeditions became shorter, more focused affairs. She'd developed an uncanny ability to find small caches of nuts and berries that other animals had hidden for winter, returning with just enough to sustain herself without depleting stores that others might need to survive. Elijah's own survival skills, honed by decades of wilderness living, proved invaluable. He knew how to stretch their food supplies, how to find water when everything seemed frozen solid, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of wind and clouds. More importantly, he understood the mountains' moods, when storms were building, when it was safe to venture out, when it was better to wait by the fire and let the world rage outside their walls. Their collaboration developed naturally, without discussion or formal agreement. The bear's knowledge of the mountain's hidden resources complemented his practical skills with tools and planning. She could locate the thermal springs he'd smelled on her fur weeks earlier, a discovery that proved invaluable when their water supply froze solid. He could set snares for rabbits and ptarmigan, providing fresh meat that neither of them could obtain alone in the deep snow. One particularly harsh morning, when the temperature had dropped so low that even the fire seemed reluctant to burn properly, Elijah woke to find the bear had moved during the night to lie partially over his bedroll, sharing her body heat without crushing him beneath her weight. The quilt was warm between them, and for a few drowsy minutes he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's illness, the simple comfort of being cared for by another living being. "Thank you," he whispered into her thick fur, and felt, rather than heard, the rumble of acknowledgement in her chest. November 15th, 1884. We're becoming something I don't have a name for. Not man and pet. She's too wild, too independent for that. Not equals exactly. We're too different from two different worlds. Partners, maybe. Companions in the truest sense. She trusts me with her safety now. Sleeps deeply even when I'm moving around the cabin, and I find myself talking to her about things I never told another soul, not even Sarah. Maybe it's easier to speak certain truths to someone who can't judge you with words. The blizzard that struck in mid-November tested both their preparations and their relationship. For 5 days, the wind howled around the cabin with such fury that venture outside meant risking death within minutes. Snow piled against the door until Elijah had to tunnel through it to reach their firewood supply. The cold was so intense that ice formed on the inside of the windows, and even huddled together near the fire, they could feel the brutal grip of winter trying to penetrate their small sanctuary. It was during this siege that Elijah truly understood how much he'd come to depend on the bear's presence. When she developed a persistent cough on the 3rd day, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of cold settling in her lungs, his fear was immediate and profound. The thought of losing her, of being alone again in this white wasteland, filled him with a panic he hadn't expected. He spent hours encouraging her to stay close to the fire, sharing his coffee ration, and even offering her portions of his precious whiskey supply when the coughing grew worse. She accepted his ministrations with patience, allowing him to check her breathing and feel her nose for signs of fever, tolerating care from hands that had no business treating a wild grizzly bear. On the 4th night, when her breathing seemed particularly labored, Elijah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He moved his bedroll directly against her side, using his own body heat and the warmth of Sarah's quilt to create a pocket of comfort in the frigid cabin. "We'll get through this," he told her, his voice steady despite his fear. "Both of us. Together." The bear's recovery began that same night, as if his promise had given her something to hold on to. By morning, her breathing was easier, and her eyes held their familiar alertness. When the storm finally broke and they emerged into the crystalline world of fresh snow and brilliant sunshine, they did so as creatures who had survived something together, who had learned that sometimes the difference between life and death was as simple as refusing to let someone face the darkness alone. Standing in the doorway of their cabin, surrounded by snow so deep it reached nearly to his waist, Elijah realized that somewhere in the midst of winter's fury he'd stopped thinking about dying. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was focused entirely on living, on getting through each day, on caring for another being, on the simple but profound act of survival shared with someone who mattered. The bear beside him made a sound of contentment as she surveyed their pristine domain, and Elijah found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. By December, their communication had evolved beyond anything Elijah could have imagined possible between human and wild animal. The bear had learned to interpret his moods with startling accuracy, approaching when he needed comfort, giving him space when his grief overwhelmed him, even seeming to sense when his old war memories surfaced during the long winter nights. In return, Elijah had become fluent in her subtle language of ear positions, breathing patterns, and the dozen different sounds she made that ranged from contentment to curiosity to concern. He knew when she was restless before she began pacing, could predict her need for solitude before she withdrew to her corner of the cabin, understood that her occasional huffing sounds were often expressions of what could only be described as amusement. The morning he decided to build the cairn, she watched from the doorway as he gathered stones from around the clearing, her head tilted with the particular attention she gave to his more unusual behaviors. The rocks were buried under snow, but Elijah knew where to dig. His trapper's instincts guided him to the places where the mountain's bones lay closest to the surface. Each stone was chosen carefully, tested for weight and balance in his hands. Before being added to the growing pile, the bear approached as he worked, sniffing the rocks with obvious curiosity. When she picked up one of the stones in her mouth and carried it to his pile, Elijah felt something break open in his chest. A recognition so profound it left him breathless. "You understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You know. What this is for? She dropped the stone at the base of his pile and stepped back, watching as he positioned it carefully among the others. Together, they spent the morning building something that had no name in either of their languages, but meant everything to both of them. A marker that honored the dead while celebrating the living. A bridge between what was lost and what had been found. When the cairn was finished, standing waist-high in the center of their clearing, Elijah pulled Sarah's wedding ring from his pocket. For months he'd carried it like a talisman, clutching it during the worst moments of grief, rubbing it smooth with his thumb during the endless nights when sleep wouldn't come. Now, for the first time since her death, he slipped it onto his finger where it belonged. For Sarah, he said aloud, and for your little ones. Gone, but not forgotten. The bear made a sound, deep, resonant, touched with a sadness that seemed to acknowledge all the losses the world had carved from both their hearts. Then she moved to the cairn and placed her massive paw against the stones, a gesture so solemn and intentional that Elijah felt tears freeze on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. December 12th, 1884, built a memorial today. Sounds simple when I write it, but it was anything but. The bear helped, actually helped, bringing stones and positioning them like she understood exactly what we were building. When it was finished, she touched it with such reverence I could barely stand. To watch, I've been thinking about the nature of souls. Do animals have them the way humans do? If they don't, how do I explain the depth of understanding I see in her eyes? If they do, what does that mean about the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the rest of creation? Sarah would have loved her. They would have understood each other, I think, two gentle creatures who knew how to love without reservation. The shortest day of the year brought a strange gift. Elijah woke before dawn to find the cabin filled with an unusual warmth. And when he stepped outside, he discovered why. The bear had spent the night packing snow around the cabin's foundation, creating an insulating barrier that kept the worst of the cold from seeping through the floorboards. It was the kind of practical kindness that left him speechless. She'd worked while he slept, using her understanding of winter survival to improve their shared shelter. The effort must have taken hours, and she'd done it without fanfare or expectation of thanks, simply because it needed doing and she had the strength to do it. You didn't have to do that, he said, when she emerged from the trees where she'd been washing the mud and ice from her paws. Her response was a soft huff that might have meant, "Of course I did," or "We take care of each other," or simply, "This is what family does." The exact translation didn't matter. The message was clear in every line of her relaxed posture as she settled down near the fire to dry her fur. That evening, Elijah read aloud from Sarah's poetry book, but for the first time, he chose verses about friendship rather than loss. The bear listened with her usual attention, occasionally making small sounds that seemed to comment on particularly beautiful passages. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep," he read, but tonight the familiar words carried different weight. "But I have promises to keep." What promises, he wondered. To Sarah's memory, certainly. To the vows they'd spoken in a church that seemed to belong to another lifetime. But also, perhaps, to the magnificent creature who'd chosen to share her grief with his, who'd taught him that healing didn't require forgetting, only the courage to let new love grow alongside old sorrow. The bear had moved closer during his reading, and now she lay with her head near his feet, close enough that he could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. Trust radiated from every line of her relaxed body. She was completely vulnerable in this position, with no quick escape route if danger appeared. It was the ultimate expression of faith between predator and prey, between wild and civilized, between two species that had every reason to fear each other. December 20th, 1884, she's been having good dreams lately. Sometimes I wake in the night to hear her making soft sounds. Not distressed like before, but contented, almost like purring if bears could purr. I think she's dreaming of her cubs, but happy memories now instead of the terrible ones that used to wake her. Maybe that's what healing looks like for both of us. Not the absence of dreams about those we've lost, but dreams that bring comfort instead of pain. Christmas came quietly to their mountain sanctuary. Elijah had never been particularly religious, and without Sarah's gentle insistence on marking the holidays, he might have let the day pass unnoticed. But something about the bear's presence made celebration feel necessary, a way of honoring not just the season, but the strange blessing of their companionship. He prepared a special meal from their limited supplies, sharing portions of preserved fruit and the last of his coffee with his unlikely friend. The bear accepted these offerings with the dignity she brought to all their interactions, seeming to understand that this was a day set apart from ordinary time. As evening shadows gathered around their clearing, Elijah found himself speaking aloud the prayer Sarah used to say before their Christmas dinners. Words of gratitude for blessings received and hopes for the year ahead. The bear listened with her head tilted, as if she too were acknowledging whatever forces had brought them together in this high, remote place. When he finished, she made one of her rumbling sounds and moved to touch the cairn they'd built together. The gesture seemed to say that she too was grateful, for warmth and safety, for companionship and understanding, for the mysterious alchemy that had transformed two broken creatures into something resembling a family. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, Elijah slept without dreaming of loss. Instead, his dreams were filled with spring, snowmelt and new growth, sunlight and the sound of his own laughter mixing with Sarah's voice on the wind. When he woke, the bear was watching him with what looked remarkably like a smile, as if she'd somehow shared his peaceful sleep. Outside, the first signs of winter's retreat were already visible in the longer days and the subtle change in the equality of the light. Soon the bear would feel the pull of instincts that had nothing to do with their shared sanctuary. Spring would bring changes neither of them could predict or control, but for now, in the depth of winter's grip, they had each other. And perhaps that was miracle enough for any season. The sound of horses struggling through deep snow reached Elijah's ears on a crisp morning in late January, when the sun was finally strong enough to begin the slow work of melting the drifts that had accumulated around their cabin. The bear heard them first, her head snapping up from where she'd been dozing near the fire, her entire body going rigid with an alertness that spoke of danger. "Easy, girl," Elijah murmured, reaching for his rifle out of habit. But the bear was already moving toward the back corner of the cabin where shadows would hide her massive form. Her instincts understood what his mind was still processing. The approach of humans meant threat, not just to her, but to the fragile peace they'd built together. 3 men emerged from the tree line, leading horses that steamed and snorted in the cold air. Even at a distance, Elijah could see they were well equipped for mountain travel, with heavy coats, sturdy boots, and the kind of weapons that meant serious business. The lead rider was a tall man with a grizzled beard, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. The other 2 flanked him like soldiers, their eyes scanning the clearing with professional wariness. Elijah stepped out of the cabin, leaving the door slightly ajar, not wide enough for the bear to be seen, but enough for her to hear everything that was about to unfold. "Morning," called the bearded man as they approached. "You'd be Elijah Trow, I'm guessing. Heard in Cheyenne that you'd bought this place." "That's right," Elijah replied, keeping his voice neutral. "And you gentlemen are?" "Name's Marcus Kane," the man said, dismounting with practiced ease. "These are my associates, Briggs and Nolan. We're tracking a killer bear, and our trail led us here." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard the softest whisper of movement as the bear pressed herself further into the shadows, and he realized with crystal clarity that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether she lived or died. "Killer bear?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. Kane nodded grimly and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Bounty poster. Fresh from the territorial governor's office. $500 for the hide of the grizzly that..." Killed little Mary Patterson down in Bear Creek Settlement. 8 years old that child was. Torn apart while playing near her family's cabin. Elijah took the poster with hands that trembled only slightly, grateful for the years of controlling his emotions during the war. The paper was official, bearing the territorial seal, and the description was detailed enough to make his blood run cold. Large female grizzly, approximately 600 pounds, distinctive scarring on left shoulder and torn right ear. The description matched his companion perfectly. "Terrible thing," Elijah said carefully, handing back the poster. "Can't imagine what the family's going through." "Happened 3 weeks ago," said Briggs, a thin man with nervous eyes. "We've been tracking the beast ever since. Trail led us up here, and with this being the only shelter for miles, we figured she might have denned up somewhere nearby." Elijah's mind raced. 3 weeks ago, the bear had been here with him, sharing their cabin, helping him survive the worst blizzards of the winter. She couldn't have killed anyone in Bear Creek. The settlement was more than 50 miles away, and the snow had been so deep that even she couldn't have made such a journey and returned without him knowing. But these men wouldn't believe that. How could he explain that he'd been living with a grizzly bear, that they'd become companions, that she was as gentle as any creature he'd ever known? They'd think he was mad. Or worse, they'd assume he was lying to protect himself from charges of harboring a killer. "Haven't seen any bears," he said, which was technically true. He'd seen one bear, and she wasn't a killer. "Mind if we look around?" Kane asked, but his tone suggested it wasn't really a request. "Check your property. Maybe scout the area?" "Free. In country," Elijah replied, though every instinct screamed at him to refuse. "Just don't expect much hospitality. I came up here to be alone." Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. "Funny thing about being alone, makes a man do strange things sometimes. Makes him forget what's civilized behavior and what's not." He gestured to his companions, who began moving toward the cabin with purposeful steps. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elijah asked, stepping to block their path. "Means sometimes men who've been alone too long start thinking wild animals are something they're not," Kane said. "Start believing they can be tamed, or reasoned with, or trusted. Seen it before. Never ends well." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Kane knew. Somehow, some way, he'd figured out that Elijah wasn't telling the complete truth about the bear. Maybe it was tracks around the cabin, maybe the scent of a large animal, maybe just the intuition of a man who'd spent his life hunting dangerous creatures. "I don't know what you're implying," Elijah said. "I'm not implying anything," Kane replied. "I'm stating facts. That bear killed a child. She's somewhere in this area. And you're the only person who could have seen her if she was here." His hand moved to rest on the butt of his rifle. "Now, are you going to help us do what needs doing, or are we going to have problems?" From inside the cabin came the softest sound, barely audible, but Elijah knew it was the bear shifting her position, preparing for whatever was about to happen. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the impossible situation they were in. These men were experienced hunters with legal authority to kill the bear. They were armed, determined and convinced of her guilt, and they were wrong, completely catastrophically wrong. "There's something you need to know," Elijah said slowly, his mind scrambling for a solution that wouldn't end in bloodshed. "About the bear you're hunting." Kane's eyes sharpened. "Go on!" "The description on your poster, scarred left shoulder, torn right ear, that's specific, very specific. Witnesses got a good look before the attack. Or," Elijah said, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield, "someone saw a bear matching that description somewhere else and assumed it was the same animal. Easy mistake to make." "What are you saying?" Elijah took a breath that might be one of his last as a free man. "I'm saying the bear you're looking for, the one that matches that description. She's been here for months, living peaceful, not bothering anyone. Which means she couldn't have killed anyone in Bear Creek 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was so complete that Elijah could hear his own heartbeat. Kane's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, Anger, and finally a cold calculation that was more frightening than either. "You're telling me," Kane said slowly, "that you've been harboring the killer bear we're hunting. I'm telling you that the bear you think is a killer isn't one. Can't be. The timeline doesn't work." "Show us," Briggs demanded, his rifle already in his hands. Elijah looked back at the cabin, knowing that the next few seconds would determine everything. The bear was waiting in the shadows, trusting him to protect her the way she'd protected him through the worst winter of his life. She'd shown him what loyalty looked like, what sacrifice meant, what love could be between two creatures who had every reason to fear each other. Now, it was his turn to prove worthy of that trust. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "But you need to understand something first. She's not what you think she is. And if you come in there with guns drawn and fear in your hearts, someone's going to get hurt unnecessarily." Kane's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Mister, if there's a grizzly bear in that cabin, someone's already made a mistake that's going to get them killed. A question is whether it's going to be us or you." Elijah turned toward the cabin door, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Behind him, 3 armed men prepared to face what they believed was a child-killing monster. Inside the cabin, a grieving mother bear waited for him to choose between his safety and her life. It was, he realized, the easiest choice he'd ever made. "Before we go any further," Elijah said, his hand on the cabin door, "I need you to understand what you're walking into. That bear, she's not aggressive. She's grieving, same as any mother who's lost her young." Kane's expression hardened. "A grieving bear is still a dangerous bear. More dangerous, some would say. Nothing more unpredictable than a female protecting territory she thinks belongs to her dead cubs." "She's not protecting territory," Elijah said. "She's protecting me." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge thrown down between them. Briggs actually took a step backward, his rifle coming up instinctively, while Nolan's eyes widened with what might have been disbelief or fear. "You've lost your mind," Kane said flatly. "Living alone up here, it's driven you mad. That animal doesn't care about you. It's using you for shelter and food, and the moment it decides you're a threat instead of a convenience, it'll tear you apart, just like it did that little girl." Inside the cabin, Elijah heard the bear shift position, and he knew she was listening to every word, understanding the tension, even if the specifics of human speech remained beyond her. He thought of the careful way she'd shared her warmth during the worst of winter, the gentle touch of her paw when his grief overwhelmed him, the patient attention she'd given to his stories about Sarah. More than that, he thought about the evidence he'd discovered just days earlier, evidence that changed everything about the hunter's mission and proved beyond doubt that they were hunting the wrong animal. "There's something else," Elijah said, "something I found last week that you need to see before this goes any further." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small metal object, tarnished with age but unmistakably military in origin. A medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor he'd received for actions during the Battle of Antietam, when he'd held a strategic bridge against Confederate forces for 6 hours while outnumbered 10-1. Kane's eyes fixed on the medal with recognition and grudging respect. "You served 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry," Elijah confirmed. 4 years start to finish. Learned a few things about tactics and survival that don't fade with time. "What's that got to do with anything?" Elijah pocketed the medal and met Kane's gaze directly. "It means I know the difference between evidence and assumption, and I know how to read sign that other men might miss." He gestured toward the tree line. "There's tracks out there. Bear tracks, but not from the animal. You're hunting. Different size, different gait, different territorial markings." This was partially true. Elijah had indeed found other bear sign during his explorations of the surrounding area, though he hadn't investigated thoroughly enough to know if it belonged to the real killer. But he needed to buy time, needed to create doubt in the hunters' minds before they did something that couldn't be undone. "Show us," Cain demanded. Can't, Elijah replied. Storm 3 days ago covered everything. But I can tell you what I found, and you can decide whether it's worth investigating before you make a mistake that'll haunt you the rest of your days. Cain's patience was wearing thin. We're not here to debate sign reading with a hermit who thinks he's tamed a grizzly bear. We're here to collect a bounty and make sure no more children die. Then at least hear me out, Elijah said, desperation creeping into his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. Give me 5 minutes to explain what I've learned. And if you're not convinced, you can do whatever you think needs doing. The three men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Cain nodded curtly. 5 minutes. But if that bear shows so much as a claw while you're talking, we put it down where it stands. Elijah's mind raced as he tried to construct an argument that would save his companion's life. Everything depended on the next few minutes, on his ability to convince three experienced hunters that their fundamental assumptions were wrong. The real killer, he began, is a boar grizzly, not a female, bigger than the one you're tracking, probably 800 pounds or more. I found his sign about 2 miles north of here, near a creek where he'd been fishing. Territorial markings on trees, claw marks too high and too wide to belong to any female. Cain's expression remained skeptical, but he was listening. More than that, Elijah continued, this boar has been moving south, following the creek drainage, toward the valley settlements. The pattern is consistent with an animal that's been displaced from its normal territory, probably by development or other human activity. It's hungry, disoriented, and increasingly willing to approach human habitation. Even if that's true, Briggs interjected, doesn't change the fact that we're tracking a female with specific markings that match witness descriptions. Witness descriptions from people who saw a bear attacking a child, Elijah said. People who were terrified, shocked, probably not in the best position to make accurate identifications. You ever been in combat, Briggs? The thin man shook his head. I have. 23 major engagements, countless skirmishes, and I can tell you that eyewitness accounts from people under extreme stress are about as reliable as weather predictions. Fear changes what people see, makes them remember details that never happened and forget things that did. You're asking us to abandon a hunt based on your theory about mistaken identity, Cain said. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you're about to kill an innocent animal while the real threat is still out there, still dangerous to any child who crosses its path. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant call of a hawk somewhere high overhead. Elijah could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, could sense the bear's tension through the cabin wall behind him. Then Cain made a decision that changed everything. Nolan, he said to the youngest of the hunters, circle around back. Make sure nothing comes out the rear of that cabin. Briggs, you watch the door. I'm going to take a look at this supposed innocent animal and make my own judgment about what, it is and isn't. Cain, wait, Elijah started. No more waiting, the hunter cut him off. No more stories about misidentification and alternative theories. Time to see what we're really dealing with. Cain pushed past Elijah and kicked open the cabin door with his boot, rifle raised and ready. The sound echoed through the clearing, like a gunshot, and from inside came a roar that shook snow from the trees, not aggressive, but alarmed, the sound of a creature suddenly confronted with mortal danger. Jesus, Briggs whispered, his face going pale. How big is that thing? Through the open doorway they could all see her now. The bear pressed into the far corner of the cabin, her massive frame seeming to fill the entire space. Her lips were pulled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers, and her eyes held the wild brightness of an animal that knew it was trapped. But she wasn't advancing, wasn't attacking. Despite her fearsome appearance, she remained in her corner, as if waiting to see what the humans would do before deciding on her own course of action. She's protecting the space, Elijah said urgently. Not threatening us, protecting what she thinks of as home. There's a difference. Difference won't matter much when those claws start swinging, Cain replied. But Elijah noticed the hunter hadn't pulled the trigger. Something in the bear's posture was giving him pause, just as it had given Elijah pause all those months ago. Put the rifle down, Elijah said. Please, just for a moment. Let me show you what she really is. You're insane. Maybe, but I'm the only one here who's lived with her for 4 months. I'm the only one who knows what she's capable of and what she's not. Elijah stepped toward the doorway, placing himself between the hunters and the bear. Give me one chance to prove she's not a killer. One chance, and if I'm wrong, you can do what you came to do. Cain's finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment Elijah thought the decision had been made. Then the hunter's eyes met his, and something passed between them. One soldier recognizing another, perhaps, or simply one man acknowledging the desperate courage of someone willing to die for what he believed in. One chance, Cain said finally. But the moment that animal makes an aggressive move, we end this. Elijah nodded and stepped into the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs as he moved toward the most dangerous creature in North America, who happened to be the closest thing to family he had left in the world. Elijah stepped across the threshold into the cabin, moving with deliberate slowness toward the massive grizzly bear that filled the far corner. Behind him, he could feel the hunter's weapons trained on both him and his companion, fingers tense on triggers, ready to fire at the first sign of aggression. "Easy, girl," he murmured, using the same gentle tone he'd developed over months of evening conversations. "These men think they know who you are, but we're going to show them different, aren't we?" The bear's ears swiveled toward his voice, and some of the wild brightness faded from her eyes. She was still pressed against the wall, still showing her teeth, but her massive head tracked his movement with recognition rather than fear. "That's it," Elijah continued, extending one hand palm up in the universal gesture of peace. "Nobody's going to hurt you if I can help it. But you need to trust me now more than you ever have." "Trow, what the hell are you doing?" Cain's voice was tight with tension from the doorway. "Proving a point," Elijah replied without taking his eyes off the bear. He was close enough now to touch her, close enough for those massive claws to end his life in a single swipe. Instead, she stretched her neck toward him and touched her nose to his outstretched palm, the same greeting they'd shared countless mornings over the past months. The effect on the hunters was immediate and profound. Briggs actually lowered his rifle slightly, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Even Cain's steady aim wavered as he watched a man calmly petting a 600-pound grizzly bear like she was an oversized dog. "This is impossible," Nolan whispered from outside the cabin. "Nothing impossible about it," Elijah said, running his hand along the bear's massive head, feeling her relax under his touch. "Just took time to understand each other, that's all. She's been grieving, same as me. Lost her cubs, probably to the same boar that killed that child in Bear Creek." The bear made one of her rumbling sounds. The one Elijah had learned meant contentment, safety, home. To the hunters it probably sounded threatening, but he could feel the tension leaving her body as she settled into their familiar routine. "Watch," he told them, and moved to the makeshift barricade he'd built from cabin furniture earlier that morning, knowing this moment would come. He'd turned the old table on its side, positioned chairs to create cover, prepared for the possibility that words wouldn't be enough to save her. "She doesn't attack," he said, deliberately turning his back to the bear and walking toward the hunters. "Doesn't threaten. She protects, but she doesn't initiate violence." Behind him, the bear remained in her corner, watching the proceedings. With intelligent eyes, but making no aggressive moves despite being surrounded by armed strangers in her sanctuary. "I've seen enough," Cain said, raising his rifle again. "Tamed or wild, that's the bear on the bounty poster. The markings match. The size matches. And keeping a grizzly as a pet doesn't make it less dangerous to other people." "She's not a pet," Elijah said sharply. "She's a companion, a partner, and she's innocent of the crime you're hunting her for." "You can't know that." "I can, and I do." Elijah moved to position himself directly in Cain's line of fire. Because 3 weeks ago, when that child was killed, this bear was here with me. She was helping me survive the worst blizzard this mountain's seen in years. She never left my sight for more than a few hours at a time, and she sure as hell didn't travel 50 miles through snowdrifts deeper than a man's height to attack anyone. Cain's eyes narrowed. You're lying. I'm telling you the truth. The only truth that matters. Elijah gestured toward his journal, sitting open on a wooden crate near the fire. It's all written down, every day, every interaction, every moment of the past 4 months. You want proof she's innocent? It's right there in black and white. Words. On paper, Briggs scoffed. You could have written anything. Could have, Elijah agreed. But why would I? Why would a man document his own madness so carefully? Why would I record conversations with a wild animal unless they actually happened? The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. 4 armed men, counting Elijah, in a space barely large enough for 2, with a massive predator watching every move. The smallest miscalculation, the slightest provocation, and blood would paint the walls. That's when the bear made her choice. She rose from her corner with fluid grace, her massive form seeming to expand as she stood to her full height. For a moment, every weapon in the cabin swung toward her, and Elijah's heart stopped as he prepared to watch his only friend die. Instead, she moved past the hunters, close enough to touch them, close enough for them to smell the wild musk of her fur, and positioned herself between Elijah and the door. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but with unmistakable intent. She was protecting him. Jesus Christ, Cain breathed. The bear settled onto her haunches in the narrow space between Elijah and the hunters, her bulk effectively blocking any line of fire toward him. Her message was clear in every line of her posture. To harm him, they would have to go through her. She's choosing, Elijah said quietly. Right now, in this moment, she's choosing to protect me over her own safety. Does that sound like the behavior of a mindless killer to you? Cain's rifle wavered, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been awe. This doesn't change what she is, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. What is she? Elijah asked. Tell me, Cain, looking at her right now, in this moment, what do you see? I see a grizzly bear that should be hibernating, but isn't. I see an animal that's formed an unnatural attachment to a human being. I see something that goes against every law of nature I know. Look deeper. Cain stared at the bear for a long moment, his weapon still raised but no longer aimed with killing intent. The bear met his gaze steadily, without challenge or submission, simply with the calm attention of an intelligent creature waiting to see what these strangers would do in her home. I see, Cain said slowly, an animal that's mourning, just like you said, and one that's learned to trust when everything in her nature should be telling her to run or fight. The admission seemed to cost him something, but Cain lowered his rifle fractionally. Doesn't change the facts, Trow. She matches the description. The territorial governor wants this bear dead, and there's $500 waiting for whoever brings in her hide. Then you'll be murdering an innocent creature for money, Elijah said. Is that the kind of man you are, Cain? The kind who kills for profit instead of justice? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Elijah could see it working on the hunter's conscience. But before Cain could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the clearing, fast, urgent, carrying the rhythm of a horse pushed to its limits. Someone's coming, Nolan called from outside. Through the cabin's small window, they could see a lone rider cresting the ridge, his mount lathered with sweat despite the cold. The man rode with the desperate urgency of someone carrying vital news, and as he drew closer, Elijah could see the glint of a badge on his coat. A territorial marshal riding hard toward their mountain sanctuary with news that would change everything or confirm the worst fears that had been driving this deadly confrontation. The bear sensed the new arrival too, her ears pricking forward with alert attention. But she didn't move from her protective position between Elijah and the hunters. Whatever was about to happen, she'd made her choice about where she belonged and who deserved her loyalty. In the tense silence of the cabin, 4 men and 1 magnificent, wild creature waited to learn whether this day would end in understanding or bloodshed. The marshal's horse collapsed to its knees in the snow as the rider dismounted, the animal's sides heaving from the brutal ride up the mountain. The lawman himself moved with the stiff gait of someone who'd spent too many hours in the saddle, but his voice carried clearly across the clearing as he approached the cabin. "Marshal Tom Garrett, Territorial Authority," he called out. "Need to speak with whoever's in charge of this hunt." Kane stepped partially out of the cabin, his rifle still ready, but pointed toward the ground. "That would be me, Marcus Kane, licensed bounty hunter. We've got the situation contained here, Marshal." "No, you don't," Garrett replied grimly, pulling a telegram from his coat pocket. "Just got word from Bear Creek. They caught the real killer." The words hit the tense gathering like a thunderbolt. Inside the cabin, Elijah felt his knees go weak with relief, while the bear seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, her massive head tilting with curious attention. "What do you mean, the real killer?" Kane demanded. Garrett waved the telegram. "Boar grizzly, just like your friend there suspected. 800 pounds if he was an ounce, with claws like cavalry sabers. Took 4 men with elephant guns to bring him down when he came back for more victims last night." "That's impossible," Briggs protested. "We followed the trail here. The description matches perfectly." "Description matches half the grizzlies in these mountains," the marshal replied. "Torn ear, shoulder scars, common injuries for bears that have survived a few seasons. The real killer had those marks too, plus a distinctive limp from an old leg break that none of you bothered to check for." Kane's face had gone ashen. "Are you telling me we were about to kill an innocent animal?" "More than that," Garrett continued, approaching the cabin doorway. "You were about to kill the bear that's been protecting these settlements for months, the boar we just put down. He's been ranging south from Canada, driving other predators out of their territories. This female here has been keeping him away from human settlements by maintaining her territory up on this ridge." Through the cabin's doorway, the marshal could see the bear sitting calmly beside Elijah, neither aggressive nor submissive, simply alert and watchful. His eyebrows rose at the unprecedented sight. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "The stories were true." "What stories?" Elijah asked. "Been hearing tales in the settlements about a hermit and his bear. Folks thought it was just mountain legend, the kind of story that grows in the telling. But here you are." Kane slowly lowered his rifle completely, the weight of what had almost happened settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "We nearly made a terrible mistake." "Nearly?" Garrett laughed harshly. "Son, you came within minutes of killing the closest thing to a guardian angel these mountains have seen. This bear's been keeping the real killers away from human settlements, and you wanted to put a bullet in her for the privilege." The bear seemed to understand that the danger had passed. She rose from her protective position and moved to Elijah's side, pressing her massive shoulder against his leg in the gesture of comfort he'd learned to recognize over their months together. Without thinking, Elijah reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out Sarah's locket, the one he'd carried but never opened since her death. His hands trembling with emotion and relief, he finally pressed the catch that released the hidden compartment. Inside was not just Sarah's photograph, as he'd remembered, but something else. A small daguerreotype of a child with Sarah's eyes. And his own stubborn chin. The baby they'd lost so early that he'd almost forgotten, buried so deep in grief that the memory had become too painful to carry. The sight of that tiny face hit him like a physical blow, but this time the pain carried something else with it, understanding. He looked at the bear beside him, at her scars and her gentle strength, at the way she'd chosen to protect rather than destroy, to nurture rather than simply survive. "She's been trying to save children," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time, keeping that boar away from the settlements. She's been protecting other people's babies because she couldn't save her own." The marshal nodded soberly. From what we can piece together, that boar killed her cubs first, then moved on to threaten human settlements. She's been following him, trying to drive him away from populated areas. Kane holstered his weapon and pulled off his hat, running his fingers through grizzled hair. "I owe you an apology, Trow, both of you." He looked directly at the bear. "We came here to kill you for something you didn't do, when you've been risking your life to protect innocents." The bear made one of her rumbling sounds, not threatening, almost conversational. Kane actually smiled slightly at the sound. "She's talking to you," he said with wonder. "She's been talking to me for months," Elijah replied. "I just had to learn how to listen." Briggs and Nolan emerged from their positions around the cabin, both looking shaken by how close they'd come to making an irreversible mistake. The tension that had filled the clearing minutes earlier was rapidly being replaced by something approaching reverence. "There's something else," Marshal Garrett said. "The territorial governor wants to meet you both. Word of this partnership has reached the capital, and there's talk of making this area a protected preserve, place where people and wild animals can coexist without fear." Elijah looked down at the bear, who was watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. "What do you think, girl? Ready to be famous?" Her response was to lean more heavily against his leg, a gesture he'd learned meant contentment and trust. Whatever the future brought, they would face it together. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of gold and amber, a group of men who had come to kill found themselves witnesses to something unprecedented. The bond between human and wild, between grief and healing, between loss and the possibility of love taking new and unexpected forms. The locket in Elijah's hand caught the light, and for the first time since Sarah's. In death, he looked at her image without pain. She would have loved this moment, he realized. Would have understood that sometimes healing comes not from forgetting what we've lost, but from learning to love again in ways we never expected. The bear beside him rumbled softly, as if agreeing with his thoughts, and together they watched. The sun set on what had been the most dangerous and transformative day of their unlikely partnership. Spring came early to Highland Ridge that year, arriving with the kind of gentle persistence that makes winter seem like nothing more than a long, necessary sleep. Elijah woke to the sound of snowmelt running in streams beneath the cabin floor, the musical trickle of water finding its way back to the earth after months locked in ice. The bear was already awake, sitting in the doorway as she did every morning, now watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. But there was something different in her posture today, a restlessness that spoke of ancient instincts stirring, of the wild calling her back to patterns older than memory. "Time, isn't it?" Elijah said softly. She turned at the sound of his voice, and he saw in her dark eyes the same mixture of love and longing that he recognized from his own heart. Spring meant freedom, meant the chance to roam territories that winter had closed off, meant the possibility of finding other bears and perhaps, though neither of them spoke of it, the chance to mother again. Over the past months since the hunters' visit, their story had indeed become legend throughout the territory. Visitors came regularly now, scientists wanting to study their relationship, government officials planning the preserve that would protect this unique sanctuary, families hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle bear who chose love over violence. The bear tolerated these intrusions with patient dignity, but Elijah could see the strain they caused her. She was a wild creature, and fame sat uneasily on shoulders built for solitude and freedom. "I've been working on something for you," he told her, moving to the workbench he'd built near the cabin's east window. The morning light fell perfectly. There, illuminating the project that had occupied his hands during the long winter evenings. The carved wooden bear was nearly finished now, not the crude attempt he'd started months ago, but a masterpiece of careful attention and deep love. Every line of the figure captured something essential about his companion. The strength in her massive shoulders, the intelligence in her alert gaze, the gentle protection in her stance. It was art, in the truest sense, born from understanding, and shaped by hands that had learned to see beyond the surface of things. The real bear approached the carving with obvious curiosity, sniffing the pine wood that still carried the scent of forest and mountain air. When she looked up at him, he could have sworn he saw approval in her expression. "It's for remembering," he explained, "so that when you're ranging free in the high country, you'll know that somewhere down here there's still a place that feels like home." She made one of her rumbling sounds. The one he'd learned meant understanding, gratitude, the complex emotion that existed somewhere between goodbye and promise. The morning routine continued as it had for months: coffee shared, quiet conversation, the comfortable silence of two beings who had learned each other's languages. But underneath it all was the awareness that change was coming, inevitable as the seasons themselves. After breakfast, they walked together to the stone cairn they'd built in winter's depth. New stones had been added over the months, offerings from visitors who understood the sacred nature of this place, who recognized that some bonds transcend the boundaries between species. The bear placed her massive paw on the stones as she always did, a gesture of remembrance for the cubs she'd lost. But today, Elijah noticed, she also touched the newest addition to the cairn, a small stone he'd placed there just yesterday, carved with Sarah's initials and the date of their wedding. "I can let her go now," he said aloud, his words carrying on the spring breeze. "Not forget, never that, but let her go to wherever souls like hers are meant to rest." The bear looked at him with those impossibly wise eyes, and he felt her understanding flow between them like water finding its level. She, too, was learning to carry love without being crushed by its weight, to honor the dead while choosing life for the living. That afternoon, as clouds gathered over the western peaks, the bear made her choice. She moved to the edge of the clearing and looked back at Elijah, her meaning unmistakable. "It was time." "I know," he said, his throat tight with emotion he didn't try to hide. "I've known for weeks." She approached him one final time, lowering her massive head so he could touch her forehead with his palm. Their familiar greeting transformed into farewell. Under his fingers, he felt the warm pulse of wildlife, the steady rhythm of a heart that had chosen healing over hatred, trust over fear. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for teaching me that love doesn't die just because its form changes, for showing me that broken things can still protect what matters most." The bear stepped back and looked around the clearing that had been their shared sanctuary, the cabin that had sheltered them, the fire ring where they'd spent countless evenings, the cairn that marked their mutual healing. Then she turned toward the tree line and the vast wilderness beyond. She paused once more at the forest's edge, looking back with what might have been a smile if bears could smile, a final acknowledgement of the miracle they'd shared. Then she disappeared into the green shadows of pine and spruce, as quietly as she'd first appeared in his life. Elijah stood in the clearing for a long time after she was gone, holding the wooden carving and feeling strangely peaceful despite the ache in his chest. Around him, spring continued its patient work, snow melt feeding new growth, birds returning from southern migrations, life renewing itself in the eternal cycle that Sarah had loved to read about in her nature books. When Marshal Garrett arrived the next day, with papers establishing the Highland Ridge Preserve, he found Elijah sitting by his fire, whittling details into the wooden bear with sure, steady hands. "She's gone, isn't she?" the marshal asked, settling down on a log beside the fire. "Gone but not lost," Elijah replied. "She'll be back, maybe not to stay, but to visit. This will always be home to her, just like it's home to me now." Garrett studied the carving in Elijah's hands. "That's beautiful." "Work. You planning to stay on as caretaker of this place?" Elijah looked around the clearing, seeing it through new eyes. Instead of a place to hide from the world, it had become something else entirely, a sanctuary where healing was possible, where different forms of life could find common ground, where love could take shapes that defied easy understanding. "Someone needs to be here," he said, to tell the story right, to make sure people understand what really happened, to protect what she protected. As if summoned by his words, a family of deer stepped delicately into the clearing, their large eyes alert but unafraid. Behind them came a pair of foxes, then a porcupine waddling with comic dignity toward the stream. Word had somehow spread through the animal kingdom that this place was safe, that the old rules between predator and prey had been suspended here in favor of something rarer and more precious. That evening, as Elijah wrote in his journal by lamplight, he found himself composing not just a record of daily events, but a love letter to the future, instructions for those who would come after him, guidelines for maintaining the delicate balance between wild and civilized that had made the miracle possible. May 15th, 1885. She came back today, just for an hour, just to check that all was well. Brought a friend with her, a young male, bigger than her but gentle in the way she's taught me to recognize. They drank from the stream and touched the cairn, and when they left, I swear I saw Cub's futures in her eyes. The wooden bear sits on Sarah's old bookshelf now, watching over the cabin when I'm away. Visitors ask about it, and I tell them it's a reminder, not of what was lost, but of what can be found when we're brave enough to love across the boundaries that seem to separate us. Tomorrow, the first group of naturalists arrives to begin their studies. They want to understand how such a bond was possible, what conditions allowed it to flourish. I'll tell them what I can, but some things can't be measured or catalogued. Some things can only be lived. Outside, the night sounds of the preserve surrounded the cabin, not threatening now, but protective, a chorus of life that had learned to trust in the possibility of peace. And in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably real, came the sound of a grizzly bear's contented rumble, carrying on the wind from somewhere in the high country where ancient freedom still held sway. Elijah closed his journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that when morning came, he would wake not to loneliness, but to purpose, not to an ending, but to a beginning that would outlast his own lifetime. The carved bear seemed to watch over his dreams, and perhaps it was imagination, but he could have sworn he felt Sarah's hand touch his shoulder as he drifted off, not to pull him backward into grief, but to push him gently forward into whatever wonders tomorrow might bring.